how do you avoid damaging your speakers? There are certain things that you can do that you have to just really be careful of in your system, whether you're running a 2-channel setup, whether you're running a home theater. And I'm going to share with you some of my recommendations, because the last thing you want to do is build this beautiful sound system, cranking it up one day, and all of a sudden you see a little smoke coming up from your tweeter, or you start smelling the voice coil of your woofer, and you're like, oh man, that ain't good. Ryan, have you ever fried a speaker?
I've never fried a speaker. I've blown cones out.
Okay.
I've never fried a speaker though.
They like too much excursion?
Well, like paper cones on old school speakers and stuff, they just blew out.
Gotcha.
I've done that. I've never I did fry a voice coil, but I think it was a bad batch. So it wasn't me pushing it too hard. It was just a bad batch.
Okay.
And you don't really need to damage a speaker in order to get undesirable things out of it, right? You can push a speaker too hard, not damage it, but get into distortion.
Correct.
That's what at the end of the day, what we're trying to avoid is just distortion.
Certainly.
Definitely want to minimize blowing up a speaker, but getting away from distortion is paramount.
So one of the thoughts that I've had, and people have asked me a lot of times on my channels, like, Michael, how much power do I need for my system? And typically, because most speakers are rated, they'll say, okay, they'll handle 150 watts to maybe 250 watts. And so they're concerned if I buy this amplifier, and this amplifier says it's 200 by, let's say 200 by 7, and they've got 7 speakers in their system, and their speakers are rated at 150 watts, am I going to blow a speaker? And what I always tell people, it's better to have too much power than not enough power. And just you don't have to do this, but to me, I have no problem having twice the amount of power that my speaker's rated to. And the biggest reason is that just gives you a ton of headroom. So when you want to really crank it up, you know that your amplifier has plenty of the power supply to be able to give that speaker all the amplification it needs to reach those levels, without getting into what Ryan's talking about, which is distortion. Of course, if you've ever cranked up your speaker, I know back in the day when I was in high school, I had like this little small system. It's not very capable.
We've all been there.
Yeah, like one of the little boom boxes, Iowa or something like that, Fisher, and so like you're cranking this thing, parents have gone to work and I've got it jamming and it's not sounding clear. Okay. That's like one of the worst things that you can do for your speakers is feed them distortion. If you get into distortion, you run the risk of banning some people from the chat right now. So that's all good.
You got it?
Yeah. Yeah, they're gone. That was funny. See, that was just a smooth transition.
That was a Linus segue right there.
But the last thing you want to do is get into distortion, because when you get into distortion, or if your amp, now I don't know exactly the scientific description of this, but it's called clipping. If your amp gets into clipping, you can absolutely mess up some speakers, and that's the last thing that you want to do. So having more headroom, having more amplification than you need is a good thing, because ultimately, who's in control of the volume? You are. And I think it's pretty safe to say, I mean, you'll know when your speakers are kind of reaching their limits. I know with the JTRs, people say, look, you can crank them. And like Jeff, I remember in one of our previous podcasts, you said Jeff even encourages people like, I want to see, like, can we break these things? I mean, like, crank them up, man. I've gotten to the point to where I don't know if I'm nervous for the speaker or if I'm nervous for my room falling apart, but I just know, okay, I get to a point where I'm like, I'm not comfortable going much louder than this. And so I think there's enough intuition that says, hey, look, this is about as far as we need to take it. But if you ever are turning up your receiver, let's say you don't have an external amplifier and you start increasing the gain, and, you're getting, if you've got the volume set to like an absolute scale, like 0 to 100, and you got it like at 80 and you bump it up to 85. And I've heard people tell me, yeah, I can turn my receiver all the way up and it sounds clean. And I call BS on that. There's no way that you can have that thing wide open. That amplifier is giving it everything it's got.
It depends on
it's
the
clean.
speakers. I mean, maybe the speakers aren't.
I
They
just,
don't. Maybe the speakers don't have a THD or a distortion coefficient.
I just can't see that. I can't see an AVR. Now, an amplifier, maybe, paired with an AVR, but just the internal AVR, and I guess it depends on how many speakers you're running to, but I would just think that it's gonna give up. So, but definitely, like, you just got to be careful. Like I said, I've never actually blown a speaker. I've never blown a woofer. I've seen some speakers like really be challenged. And there were even a couple times when I was playing a movie, I took my Eclipse RF7s because they've got a big or dual 10s in them. And so I was just curious. I'm like, I wonder what they would do and how they would sound in full range. You hear some guys, they're like, oh man, you ought to run those speakers because they're big woofers on full range. I'm like, okay, let's try it. Well, I was playing, I don't even remember what movie I was watching, like Hulk or something. And whatever scene it was playing some low frequencies. And I'll just be honest with you, they did not handle it very well. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so I backed it way down. And so anytime you start hearing it's just not clean, whether it's the bass frequencies, mid-range, or the highs, you got to back that down because the last thing you want to do is blow a driver, blow a tweeter. But having more power, having clean power with an external amplifier will help you. And of course, the more speakers you have, the more you're going to be taxing like an AVR. If you're running 11 speakers, you're asking a lot from that receiver. And then the other issue is not issue, but the other thing you got to consider is how sensitive are your speakers. If your speakers have like, if you look at the rating and they're like 90, 92, 93 or higher, that means they're going to be easier to drive than a speaker that is in the 80s, 82, 83. If you got a speaker that's 83 decibels and you're trying to run 7, 9, 11 speakers off just an AVR and you're wanting to crank it up really loud, it's going to struggle. It's going to be harder. And so there you're going to get closer to the point of, I may run out of gas on this thing, and that may cause distortion, and that distortion can ruin my speakers. So, Ryan, what are your thoughts?
On the opposite end of that, I think people have depending on the speaker, they have a over-exaggerated expectation of how much power their speakers are actually utilizing.
Correct.
Right. So most of the time speakers, especially if we're doing JTR, clips can be exaggerated for their sensitivity. But people aren't actually using that much power, especially if they're not getting close to reference. So I think if I remember this formula correct, your sensitivity typically on a speaker, like Martin Logan's, I know is at 1 meter, X decibels, say 93 decibels at 2.83 volts. That's at 1 meter in however they measured it and whatever room it was, they got 93 decibels with that voltage coming from the
1 watt,
the 2.83 volts. So then you drop 6 dB for every doubling of distance. So if your seating position is X distance away, you would subtract 6 dB away from that starting point. And then that is actually going to be your starting point for your main listening position. Okay. Then every meter you move closer to that position, you double the amount of power needed, right? So you're doubling if you go from 1 watt to 2 watts. And that gets you to 2 meters. And then 2 watts to 4 watts. And then 4 watts to 8 watts. And then 8 watts to 16 watts. And it just keeps going. Right? So that is going to get you pretty close to where you're going to need to be for power requirements. Now, the other thing that you need to consider is that does not account for EQ or your room. And things can be vastly different if you have nulls or you're corner loaded or EQ is needing to boost things, whatever. That is directly going to impact how much power you're utilizing at your main listening position. But for really sensitive speakers like JTRs or like the RTJ 410s, they're 100 dB sensitive at 1 meter, right? So you're using like 8 watts for reference volume, if you're not using EQ at a main listening position of like, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, of like 12 to 15 feet.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. 8 watts.
Yeah.
So you don't need that much power. And again, guys, that was me just pulling it out of my butt. I didn't do that calculation. So take that for what it is. But my point is that a lot of people think, oh, I need huge amounts of power. Now, there are some times when you do need huge amounts of power. Like my Martin Logans, my 15As eat amps for breakfast when they are going towards reference volume. I can very easily push them into protection because the Martin Logans, how they're designed and because they're electrostatics, as they near certain high frequencies, they can push down to just over 0 ohms, right? And that's just the design of the speaker. But I'm virtually shorting out my amplifier. So because of that, I need very robust amplifiers that don't have a problem with that. And typically that comes with very, very strong amplifiers. And I've had my fair running even with, PS Audio that say they're awesome and a bunch of other brands, and they just couldn't do it. Yeah. So it's really important that you, one, understand your speaker, and two, understand how much power you need to your main listening position. And then three, make sure that you are not overdriving your speaker to get to the needed volume at the main listening position. If you are listening to something and your ears hurt, you are listening to distortion.
Yeah.
And it's really important at that point that you need to turn it down, move things closer, or get different types of speakers, because you're actively distorting the audio. Because think about this. If you go to a concert and it's a well-done concert, it can be 120 dB and your ears don't hurt. You may be fatigued the next day, but when you're there in the room, you're like, this is really loud, but your ears aren't hurting. So just think about that. And then if you're in a room and your ears hurt, you're listening to distortion. And it's really important at that point to just tone things down, lower the volume. You're driving your speakers into distortion. You need to make some changes if you want to listen that loud.
For sure.
Somebody asked what amps I use for my 15As. I have QSC CX 1102s, so I can push about 1,700 watts per channel.
Plenty of power there.
Plenty of juice.
Absolutely.
Plenty of juice.